Now, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has been in Israel attempting to broker some kind of a peace deal, but Israel remains under attack from Iran-backed Hamas and Hezbollah, and the world awaits Israel's retaliation against Iran itself, of course. I asked former Foreign Minister Alexander Downer for his assessment of the situation.
Well, my advice to the Americans is, who do we want to win this war? We want Israel to win it, so the Israelis have got to pursue the tactics, the military tactics that they think are going to be most likely to work. I mean, the Americans have been telling them to de-escalate, to stop attacking Hamas in Gaza, to stop attacking Hezbollah, to go easy on the Iranians. It's all been bad advice. The best advice we can give to the Israelis is to take out their enemies and make sure that in the future they can't be attacked and there's a system of deterrence established. So in terms of Iranian targets, I mean, the Israelis are going to have to work out what the best targets are. I imagine there'll be missile launching and missile storage sites and so on, military targets, of course. But the Americans shouldn't be trying to micromanage a war that they are not directly fighting. They should let the Israelis do that and make sure the Israelis win.
I'm still baffled. It still astonishes me daily that all we hear from the international community, including Australia and the US, of course, is for Israel to de-escalate. Where are the calls now to Hamas to say, hand over the hostages, surrender yourselves, you've lost your leadership, you can't win anything out of this, the best thing for you and your people is to surrender? Why don't we hear those calls?
I mean, it's incomprehensible, and I think, I'm sorry, I think some of it is born of anti-Israeli, even anti-Semitic sentiment. I mean, look, the bottom line here is Israel has to win. Its enemies have to surrender unconditionally and the hostages handed over. Of course, the war will finish in 10 minutes if the hostages are handed over and Hamas gives an undertaking not to attack Israel any further. Of course they won't be fighting in Lebanon if Hezbollah give a commitment not to attack Israel anymore and unconditionally, if you like, surrender. But, you know, every major war we've been involved in, the Second World War, we didn't ask the Nazis or tell our soldiers to de-escalate, or asked the Nazis to de-escalate. We demanded surrender, unconditional surrender, and once they surrendered, the war ended. So once Hamas surrender, and once they hand over the hostages, once Hezbollah surrender, and Iran give a commitment not to attack Israel anymore, the war will be finished, just like that.
Spot on, Alexander. It's just tragic that we don't hear world leaders talking in those terms. That's what we need, that support for that outcome and support for Israel getting to that outcome. I want to go to another flashpoint we haven't focused on enough, and that, of course, is Ukraine. How disturbed should we be by this news that North Korean soldiers are in Ukraine, that the Russians are now sending in North Korean soldiers?
Well, I think we should be concerned on two fronts. First of all, it demonstrates the Russians are really struggling. The Americans tell me that 120,000 Russian soldiers have been killed, 120,000 in the Ukraine war since February 2022, and 500,000 wounded. I mean, it's a terrible toll that Putin has imposed, ultimately he has imposed on his people. So the reports are that something like 10 to 12,000 North Korean troops have been recruited to help the Russians. The problem with this is, talking of escalation and de-escalation, they are escalating this war into something that is becoming, if you like, an international war. And that is the great fear, that all of these wars will gradually come together. You know, China versus Taiwan, the Iranians against the Israelis using their proxies, and the Russians against the Ukrainians, and they're all supporting each other. And this is a very great danger, which does underline the really important need for the Americans and their allies to provide truly effective deterrence. for all of those adversaries to understand if they keep going this way, then terrible things will happen to them.
I think I should just correct myself on the fly. I said those North Korean troops were in Ukraine. That's not the case. We know they're in Russia now, and there are fears they'll be used to supplement Russian troops in Ukraine. Yeah, expected to be on their way to Ukraine, but no evidence they're there yet. Just on that, talking about the role, the importance of American leadership, let's look at the election that's just over a week away now, and Kamala Harris out today making, very serious words of concern to the nation about Trump and Mike Kelly's words again that he's a fascist and he likes Hitler. I mean, this seems like a very desperate ploy this late in the campaign, doesn't it?
Sure. I mean, this does illustrate the closeness of the race and the desperation as the race comes to an end. I mean, desperation on both sides. But, I mean, the Democrats have been running this line that Donald Trump is a fascist and a Nazi and everything under the sun. I mean, it's clearly, whatever you think of Donald Trump, it's clearly completely absurd, completely absurd. And I've been in America for the last few weeks. Obviously, the American people know it's just political rhetoric and a scare campaign. I don't think it's helping them. I think the problem for Kamala Harris is people think she doesn't have a clue about policy issues. And whilst, in my experience, Americans don't much like Donald Trump, and they certainly don't like the things we don't like about him, they think on policy he's quite good. And they prefer his economic policy and his security policy and his international policies to Kamala Harris's. So running this scare campaign is all the Democrats have left. It may work, but I'm not sure. I think it remains neck and neck.
Alexander Downer, thanks again for joining us.
It's a pleasure, Chris.